All right, my friends, welcome to season 5 of National Parks Presents. Today is our third of 6 presentations, so we are officially halfway. We are here every other Wednesday, and we'll be here to the end of March. We used to go to April, but guess what we discovered? Everyone loves the outdoors in April, including us. So we are going to March because we have other more fun things for you guys in the summer and spring as well. Thank you also so much for being here. I know registration was super weird. We tried something new, and it's okay to try new things. We just discovered this one didn't work, and we needed to go back and we'll go back to the drawing board and figure something out. But I appreciate you guys being here, finding the registration link again, and even re-registering if you already registered prior. I do appreciate it. I know it's kind of a pain, so thank you. I'll probably send out the March links as well because why stop now? We only have one more month. So and as I mentioned before, we do so many fun things throughout the year, but also I'm going to put in our chat eventually of the national parks event listings because they do wonderful, wonderful programs as well. And I definitely want you guys to check them out. Now, let's go into our Zoom features, even though you're like, Karen, as you said, it's season 5, but it's always good to have a refresher. So we are recording. We've recorded starting probably halfway through our second season. So if you want to catch up on this one or past ones, including Cyclorama, that was 2 weeks ago, you can go to the BPL YouTube page. The fastest way, honestly, to find it is to go to Google, type in Boston Public Library YouTube, and it'll be the first one right there. They don't pop up automatically. It is not done by a computer. It is done by our wonderful AV team, and they do have other things that they are doing. So it takes roughly 2-ish weeks for them to come up, but when they are, they will be there, I promise. Okay. Oh, if you are not enjoying the captions on your screen, you can also turn them off at the bottom of the ribbon of Zoom. Something we discovered last week is that some people don't enjoy the chat box. If you don't enjoy the chat box in the right, there we go, my right and left, you could X out of the box. There's a little X in the top right of the webinar chat, and it will close, but it won't close the whole thing. And you'll be able to carry on without seeing people typing. Now, if you love the chat box and you don't want to close it, oh my goodness, please ask your questions. We have Ranger Sean is back. That's because Ranger Stephen is presenting. So Sean will be going through the chat box, seeing your questions, and at the end, he will ask them. We are a webinar that keeps this open, which is very, very rare, and that's because you guys are such a great audience. As always, we don't be shy. Ask any question you want. We just ask you to be respectful. That's all. We love respect. Big respect people over here. And I think it's the fastest I've ever done that. So before you X out of this computer completely after the presentation, there will be a survey that pops up. If you could fill that out, that would be wonderful. And without further babbling from me, please let's welcome Ranger Stephen as he presents African American mariners in the Revolutionary War.
Okay, hello everyone. How does the slideshow look, Sean?
Looks good.
Okay, so this is my first program with BPL, and thank you for inviting me to it. My name is Ranger Steve. I'm with the National Parks of Boston, of course, and the program today is on African American mariners during the Revolutionary War. So, as you all know, the 250th of the American Revolution is approaching, and I think this is a very appropriate subject matter for that because two of our parks, Boston African American National Historic Site and Boston National Historical Park, both have overlaps with both of these themes. And of course, it's Black History Month. And finally, of course, Boston was a very prominent port city during this period in time in the 18th century. So I became interested in the subject matter of privateering the Revolutionary War but it didn't seem like there was a lot written about African Americans who served in this capacity. So I kind of went out and did some searching for material and sources. And I was surprised that there's actually a lot of primary sources out there, just not a lot of secondary sources. So I'm going to kind of reveal some of those things that I found today. I'm not necessarily an expert on the subject, but I will try to answer your questions as best I can. So one thing with the sheer number of sources out there is that it indicates to me just how important that people of color were to the maritime world in the 18th century. Around a quarter of all sailors were either of African or indigenous descent. So when we think of um, those individuals who fought in the Revolutionary War of that background, I think if you're familiar with the Revolutionary War, you might have heard of regiments like the 1st Rhode Island, which was uh, folks who met that description led by white officers, almost like the 54th Massachusetts uh, during the American Civil War much later. But as far as those who served at sea, that's kind of what we're going to explore today. So a little bit of a different take on the Revolutionary War. So there's a few different profiles of individuals that I divided up into different categories. So we're going to explore several individuals, those who served on merchant ships, those who were on warships, which are privateers or through the Navy. And finally, we're going to end with some enslaved people who actually became free as a result of their service. And since the program series is about revolutionary art, I think this would be a good intro here. So if you look at the painting on the left, so from what I read and heard is that this painting actually, though it clearly is a black privateer, the painting was from the 18th century. It was actually discovered during a restoration when they were cleaning it that it was actually a white privateer. So somebody painted over the white privateer, likely because a African American privateer is a very rare subject for painting. So in fact, this has likely been painted over. Just a little tidbit that I found out in some of my research. On the right, that's James Forten, and we'll talk about him a little bit later in the program. So I'm going to start with the merchants and mariners. Um, so uh, a lot of the merchants and mariners, as I mentioned before, that although African American mariners is an important part of the program today, a lot of them as well had indigenous ancestry or indigenous descent. And so uh, because of that, there's a lot of variety to the people who serve. Some of them were free, some of them were enslaved, who served on merchant ships. And in addition to that, labor and race relations may have been slightly different on those who served on ships out at sea as opposed to those who served on land. So it was a different dynamic. They tended to be more integrated, being on ships than they were at sea on land in regiments, for example, like the 1st Rhode Island. That's certainly not saying that discrimination wasn't happening. It certainly was at this time, as you can imagine. But generally speaking, there was more personal freedoms on a ship at sea, even though that work was very difficult. There were lots of hazards for those who were out at sea. But many indigenous people and African Americans were valued for their skills as pilots and navigators. So this wasn't something to where the Revolutionary War happened and then all these individuals decided this was an opportunity to get more freedom, more independence being on a ship. Many of them were already pilots and navigators. And in some very rare cases, free blacks were actually paid more than white sailors for these specialized skills. So there's definitely a source of labor here of people who are very skilled at this trade already. And very rarely do they ever make it to the rank of captain. Interestingly enough, um, there were African American captains, but they're actually enslaved, and that seems kind of counterintuitive. But if you're an enslaved individual, you have a lot of skills as a pilot or navigator. The enslaver would actually give them that freedom to be a captain, which is very curious because most free African Americans and people of indigenous descent were not given that opportunity. So we're going to use Boston's North End as a brief case study about what life was like for people of color laboring in the maritime and merchant trades. So as you can see on the far left there, that's a map of Boston in 1775. In the North End, the waterfront would have been much closer to where it is today, and I'm sure all the folks here in Boston are going to know that quite well. But this is an area where laborers, sailors, merchants would have been active along incoming and outgoing ships on the wharves. There was a mix of free and enslaved people in the North End, African Americans, Native Americans, Caribbean-born, American-born people of color. And in the 18th century, one great quote I found from a historian is that 20% of male slaves in Suffolk County were owned by enslavers with connection to the sea. And a lot of those enslaved laborers were rope makers, they were sail makers, they were coopers, they were shopkeepers. And of course, their owners, their enslavers, were people like Peter Faneuil, who grew wealthy, being complicit with the slave trade in the Atlantic world. But the experience of one enslaved sailor in Boston is really interesting. His name was, I believe, Britton Hammond. Hammond was, as I mentioned, enslaved, but he made a 13-year journey around the Atlantic as a slave, laboring on merchant ships for 2 different countries before he came back home. So it gives you an atypical example of what an enslaved person could experience. But nonetheless, it's a good example of the fact that many enslaved people, although they were on ships, what they were doing is they were communicating with different networks of African Americans when they're going from port to port. And of course, this industry was one of the few industries open to people of color at this time in the 18th century. But of course, in New England, many people labored on whaling ships, which could be equally dangerous and difficult work. And so what we're going to do is we're going to discover some of the first profiles here of people who served on those type of vessels. First one, I think is very appropriate. I think most people here are going to know Crispus Attucks. He was famous for his involvement in the Boston Massacre, in which he was killed instantly. But we actually know little of Attucks outside of his death. What we do know is that he was likely both African American and Native American. He was born in Framingham, Massachusetts. And in fact, the witnesses from the massacre described him differently. Some people said he was a mulatto. Some people say he was, quote, Indian. Nonetheless, his last name is indigenous in origin. It comes from the Natick word for deer. Hope I'm pronouncing that tribe right. So there's a likely scenario which he probably had both forms of heritage. But his other name was Michael Johnson. And this could have been an alias which protected him from a return to slavery. So he reportedly fled from slavery from his hometown to sign on a whaling ship. The Boston newspapers reported him as a resident of New Providence in the Bahamas. So this was an individual, again, going back with the earlier person we discussed, who made a trip all around the Atlantic for several years. Although enslaved, there was still a network of people who were able to get out and communicate in different parts of the Atlantic. So Attucks was reportedly at the head of a group of sailors who brandished clubs marching down King Street on March 5th, 1770. Some of you already know the story quite well. They began pelting the British soldiers with snowballs. British soldiers opened fire, and Attucks was shot by 2 musket balls and killed instantly. He had no family, so he was buried in, I'm sorry, his remains, his body was on display in Faneuil Hall, along with another individual killed in the attack. And of course, he's buried in the granary where the other victims of the massacre are buried, and certainly became a martyr as a result. So you can see a 1943 painting on the left of Attucks depicted as such. And William Cooper Nell, who was a very important uh, African-American activist himself in the 19th century, wrote, I believe, Patriots of Color about African Americans to serve in the Revolutionary War, labeled Attucks as a first martyr of the Revolution, which is a very appropriate first individual to begin with. So we'll switch gears to another person of color who served on the whaling ship, and this is Paul Cuffey. So Paul Cuffey has a few things in common with Attucks. He was born in Massachusetts. Just like Attucks, he had a mixed African American and Native American heritage and descent. He labored on a whaling ship, but unlike Attucks, the big difference with Paul Cuffey is that he was free. And so his experience was slightly different. Uh, in 1773, he embarked on a whaling ship for the West Indies, and another voyage in 1776 when he was captured by the British and sent to a prison in New York Harbor. The prisons were very brutal affairs in the Revolutionary War, British prisons, as we'll discover later with James Forten. It was very unlikely you would survive them, but nonetheless, Paul Cuffey did. He later served on merchant ships that attempted to break the British blockade by delivering supplies. Towards the end of the Revolutionary War, Paul Cuffey's activist sphere became visible. So at 21, he and friends petitioned the Massachusetts legislature for the right to vote, which was denied. Of course, in 1783, things changed. But nonetheless, once again, you're seeing an actively mobile person of color who's free, who's able to have these freedoms to be able to petition for the right to vote. And obviously, there was plenty of discrimination. Slavery was still existing during the Revolutionary War in Massachusetts, but nonetheless, by being on ships, by being out in the world, he was able to kind of get a measure of confidence and communicate more with others. So after the war, Cuffey and his brother-in-law, who was of Wampanoag descent, started a shipping business, which gradually expanded, and they slowly started with small ships to bigger ships. And Paul Cuffey actually became one of the wealthiest people of color in the United States. He had a shipbuilding business as well as land holdings in Westport. And he even helped to incorporate an integrated school. So as Paul Cuffey got older and he was expanding his commercial dealings around the Atlantic Ocean, he became engaged with Quaker businessmen, abolitionist leaders in Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, London. He became interested in the colonization of African Americans, and he actually visited the African colony of Sierra Leone in 1811, which was organized by formerly enslaved people. So he became an early advocate for colonization. He actually transported several families using his own money to transport them to the colony. He wrote positively about it, but there was strong opposition to that. Very few African Americans in the 18th and 19th centuries were pro-colonization. There were some, like Cuffey, but many of them rejected that over time. So Paul Cuffey passed away in 1817. You notice his headstone, if you look at it, it says Captain Paul Cuffey, which is quite an achievement for a person of color to not only be called a captain, but to attain the wealth and the status that he had as a businessman. So moving to a different individual. So Jeremiah Thomas was actually not from New England. So this is a different setting. We're moving down into South Carolina and Charleston. And the image that you see here is Charleston in 1778. So Jeremiah Thomas did have something in common with Paul Cuffey, though. He was an African American of wealth, and he was a free African American living in South Carolina. He was described as a free Negro of considerable property. And paradoxically, he actually was a slave owner as well. But one prominent white South Carolinian described Thomas as puffed up by prosperity, as ruined by luxury and debauchery, and grown to an amazing pitch of vanity and ambition. So you clearly see with Jeremiah Thomas, there was a great deal of jealousy going on here as a free African American who's getting wealth. And that could have led to what we're going to talk about next. So Thomas had experience. He was a merchant, he was a fisherman, a very experienced pilot in navigating ships in Charleston Harbor before the Revolutionary War. He was familiar with the local waterways. Going to the next slide here, the images that you see are of Charleston Harbor during this period in time around 1775. But supposedly Jeremiah Thomas was trying to plot an insurrection. He was trying to seek out help from the British Navy to take Charleston. And so the story goes, he was hoping that the British would help the plight of enslaved people seek freedom. Now, when the authorities caught wind of that, Thomas denied it. He said he was innocent, even though he was accused by his own brother-in-law. Regardless of that, he was found guilty for plotting this insurrection. And he was hanged in 1775, unfortunately. So we'll never know the full story, whether he was guilty or innocent of that, what his intentions were. But nonetheless, you see an individual here with a great deal of experience who's influencing the cities that they lived in, a free person. So we're going to move on to the second topic here, which is, as I mentioned, the other group that we're going to talk about, people of color, is those who served in privateer ships and in navies. So before we actually talk about some of those individuals, I want to mention briefly how the navies and privateering looked in the United States during the Revolutionary War. So the United States obviously was a fledgling, small, new country, and they didn't really have a solid navy. The Continental Navy was very small. The state navies oftentimes supported the naval establishment as well. So you had this complex thing where you had Massachusetts with a navy, and Virginia with a navy, then you had the Continental Navy. So it was very complicated. You even had states like Maryland and Virginia, which purchased enslaved people for their own navies. But like the compatriots on the land, these people of color signed up for service, did earn a great deal of acclaim when they served in these state navies, whether they're free or enslaved. And we have a couple examples of that. So James Barron, who was a captain in the Virginia Navy, recalled several Black men saying that they were courageous patriots who, in justice to their merits, should not be forgotten. And a little closer to home, Captain John Closton of the Massachusetts Navy said 2 African Americans under his command that they shipped on board the armed brigantine Freedom to fight against the enemies of America, and in that respect have rendered themselves worthy of the notice of America. By no means liable to be sold merely because they're Black and their masters have a property in their service. So we can see that already there was a great deal of people of color who served in the Continental and state navies, but we're going to switch to privateering. Because with privateering, there was a little bit more incentive for people to sign up. But just like with the navies, you had a complex organization. So you had states issue their own letters of marque, as well as the Continental Congress issuing letters of marque. And what you see there is the Continental Congress authorizing a letter of marque. So if you don't know what a letter of marque was, that was basically a license to legally attack and capture British merchant vessels. So they weren't pirates, they were privateers. It was a legal thing. And privateers had a very important impact on the outcome of the Revolutionary War. They took British merchant ships, created chaos. British ships of war were then dispatched to the colonies to protect shipping. So it was a very important aspect of the Revolutionary War is privateering. But in any case, unlike serving in the navies in the Revolutionary War, serving on a privateer offered a better share of prize money for captured vessels taken. And this could be immensely profitable for people who decided to get in this enterprise, wealthy businessmen who wanted to invest and sponsor privateering vessels. But for people of color, signing up on a privateer had several benefits as opposed to signing up in the Navy. So first of all, if you're a freedom seeker and you're trying to escape slavery, it was better to serve on a private vessel to avoid detection than an official Navy ship. Serving on a ship with integrated crews was more common. As I mentioned earlier, you had a lot of African American, indigenous people fraternizing with the white crew, telling stories, gambling. In Pennsylvania, there was actually a preference of free blacks to serve on privateers. In 1776, there's actually an instance where two enslaved people served on a Massachusetts privateer called the Yankee. And so right up there, you have a little write-up from, I believe that's from the New Hampshire Gazette about a privateer battle that occurred. So we're going to move on to one of our profiles here. So James Forten is probably one of the most significant African Americans in the United States in the 18th century, arguably. James Forten became very wealthy, but he started out in Philadelphia, and you can see right here, this is a view of Philadelphia in 1768. His father and grandfather were both free, and at the start of the Revolutionary War, his family was one of the few free black families living in Philadelphia. He could have been emboldened by the law passed in 1780 in Pennsylvania that allowed for the gradual abolition of slavery. Being a free young man, being 14 years old, a young James Forten decided to set out on his own, and he signed up for a privateer. So the ship that he signed up on was called the Royal Louis. And at 14 years old, Forten actually delivered the gunpowder from the magazine to the guns on the gun deck, which is a very dangerous task. And in the first battle the Royal Louis had with a British ship called the Active, there were heavy casualties. And James Forten actually comments on how a few of those on the gun deck during the battle actually survived. He was one of the few survivors of that attack. But the Royal Louis arrived back in Philadelphia after the voyage to much fanfare, captured several enemy ships, and Forten decided to sign up for another voyage with the Royal Louis, but this time he didn't have the same luck. So the Royal Louis ran into a British frigate and was forced to surrender. When Forten went on the British ship, the captain was so impressed with Forten and offered him a chance to be brought under his patronage to study in England, and Forten refused. Forten said, quote, "I am here a prisoner for the liberties of my country. I never shall prove a traitor to her interests." So he was not willing to go along with that deal. But nonetheless, James Forten, because of that, he was sent, like all the others, as a prisoner of war to a British prison ship. And what you see there on the left-hand side, the image is of the Jersey. So this was a former British warship converted to a prison ship. And the condition on British prisoner of war ships was awful. And the Jersey was probably the worst one where Fortin was sent to. So you can see it was converted into a prison ship by the image there. Many who survived it call it hell afloat. It was overcrowded. It was ripe with disease, unsanitary conditions. We don't know how many perished on the Jersey, but it's estimated 11,000 American prisoners died on prison ships during the Revolutionary War. Fortunately, Fortin survived. He was released in 1782. And you can see an interior engraving from the 19th century depicting those conditions there. So Fortin, after the Revolutionary War, he slowly built up his business. So he actually started as a sailmaker, and he ended up becoming very wealthy. His sailmaking business in Philadelphia uh, expanded. He had 25 apprentices and numerous employees working for him. On the left, you see a map of Philadelphia from 1816, and the right is a portrait of Fortin from around the same time. But with the wealth, he didn't simply invest in his personal self, but he became an important leader in Philadelphia's Black community. So he became a strong advocate for civil rights. He opposed the colonization movement, and he became the vice president of the American Anti-Slavery Society. And also with connection here with Boston African American National Historic Site, James Fortin also helped William Lloyd Garrison fund the Liberator newspaper, which of course was one of the most important anti-slavery newspapers in the country. James Fortin's son, Robert, followed his father's legacy. Robert was a sailmaker, he was an abolitionist, and he also served in a Union regiment, which I believe was a 43rd U.S. Colored troops during the Civil War. But unfortunately, his son didn't make it. He died of typhoid in 1864. So the other profile that I want to talk about is that of Peter Boston. So Peter Boston and his brother Silas were both free men from Nantucket. This is Nantucket here in 1778. They served together on a Massachusetts Navy ship, and they were part of the Penobscot expedition in 1779. And that didn't end very well. So that was one of the biggest losses during the Revolutionary War for the American Navy. 40 American vessels were burned and scuttled. And the painting here is depicting the British ships during that battle. But Peter Boston actually survived it. Although his ship was scuttled, he was cast ashore in Maine in the woods, and incredibly, he made it all the way back home. So he made it back home. He saw further service in the Massachusetts and Connecticut navies, as well as privateers. And I found some of his pension records. It's a big file. There's quite a bit in it. But what you see here are the records that basically vouch for his service in the Revolutionary War so he could get that pension. And in order to get a pension, you need someone who was reliable that you served with who could vouch for you. And Peter Boston vouched for his comrades who were on the ships, and they also vouched for him. One of them was Brown Coffin, who was on the same ship as Peter, and he described Peter as a good a seaman as anyone on board. The officers were satisfied with him, and he was ready at a call. So that the final record there is basically what Peter got as a pension, which went to his wife when he passed away. On the far right, you can see her name, which was Rhoda. So Peter left his wife a small house and land, but nonetheless, he was able to get that pension because of his service. Another interesting thing about Peter Boston and looking at the pension records is that both white and African American or indigenous people all basically vouched for each other's service and were on fairly good terms. Now, we don't know, obviously, all those personal details. Certainly, you would have incentive, but nonetheless, there was quite a few of white people from Nantucket who knew Peter Boston, who uh, gave him a very good record when it came to the pension. So it shows that there was perhaps some camaraderie from service at sea that went past racial boundaries. So I'm going to move on to the final category here. So we mentioned a little bit about people who served on merchant ships, whaling ships before the Revolutionary War, and those that served in privateers and with the state navies. So I want to discuss and wrap this up with a little bit of information on how enslaved people became free from their service during the war. And one thing to keep in mind, of course, is that this was not common, right? This was, I wouldn't say a rare experience, but it was not the experience that everyone had. Many people were enslaved. In some cases, they were forced onto these ships and were not granted their freedom. But what I want to show you first here is this right here. So this is Lord Dunmore's proclamation in 1775. So he was a British royal governor of Virginia. And he basically, early in the part of the war, he was giving an incentive for enslaved people to gain their freedom if they fought for the British. And he issued it, and there was mixed results. It wasn't the results he was looking for. There were maybe a few hundred who actually got their freedom because of that, but I think Lord Dunmore or John Murray, who was the British royal governor, expected more to sign up. And you can see a little bit more detail of the bottom of Lord Dunmore's proclamation there that he issued. There were freedom seekers who got their freedom not from the British, not from the Americans, but they got their freedom from themselves. They self-emancipated themselves, taking advantage of wartime turmoil. And one of those individuals was Samuel Johnson. So this was an enslaved person, and in the chaos of the Revolutionary War, he actually made his way to the wharves in the Chesapeake Bay region, escaped, and became a free sailor. He traveled all the way to the West Indies on several voyages. Though he was re-enslaved and caught in Philadelphia later, he escaped again from slavery in 1785. So I'm kind of skipping ahead a little bit. I'll discuss the document on the right in just a second. But certainly enslaved people were freed on the American side for a variety of reasons. We have an example of an enslaved man in Virginia who served in the, I believe, the Virginia Navy, supposedly became friends with Patrick Henry, and he was granted his freedom by the Virginia General Assembly. We have someone named Joseph Ranger, who is actually already free man in Virginia that served with the British, I'm sorry, the Virginia State Navy during the Revolutionary War until the end of the war. But although he was free, he was able to purchase his wife's freedom at the end of the Revolutionary War from the earnings that he got serving with the Navy. But the document on the right there, so that's actually from the Virginia General Assembly as well. So that's for an individual named Caesar, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but Tarrant, Caesar Tarrant. He was a pilot during the Virginia State Navy during the war. He actually outmaneuvered a British vessel, and his captain said that he behaved gallantly. And so at the end of the Revolutionary War, because of his service, he was granted the freedom by the Virginia General Assembly. And that's what you see there in that document that was passed on the 14th of November, 1789. So again, I don't want to overemphasize the fact that this was a common practice, but at the same time, we also have to recognize that enslaved people did get a chance to become free from their service on various occasions during the Revolutionary War, or in some cases, like I mentioned with Samuel Johnson, they were able to be proactive and self-emancipate themselves as freedom seekers. So I think the final question now is what can we learn from this experience of African American and Native American mariners? Why is all of this important? Well, I think, again, for some, this was a possible opportunity to participate in the economic prosperity of the early United States. After the Revolutionary War, the young country experienced a great deal of trade, economic prosperity. Places like Salem, Boston became very important port cities. Salem at one point was one of the wealthiest cities in the United States because of trade. And so many of these people of color were able to, although they didn't get that full economic prosperity, many of them were able to um, experience some of that. And we talked, of course, about those exceptional individuals earlier, like Fortin, who became very wealthy, but that was an extreme case. The other second point I think that's very important about all of this is that what all these individuals were doing when they were out at sea, whether they're enslaved or free, is that they were helping to establish communication networks among other communities of color. And so in the 19th century, as the Underground Railroad became more and more important, familiarity with these waterways helped establish these communication networks. People like, of course, Harriet Tubman was able to become knowledgeable from African American mariners who would stop in and out of places on the Chesapeake Bay region. So I think that's really one of the most important takeaways from this program and from the experience of both African American and indigenous peoples who were basically subjected to slavery, but were able to, some of them anyway, become free from this experience. So that's the end of the program. Go ahead and see if there's any questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. Really appreciate all the information you just shared, especially the bios of individuals. I thought that was really powerful. So we do have a couple questions. And then if there are any additional ones that do come in the chat, obviously feel free to keep asking them, and I will, share them with Steve. So could you, and I know that you touched upon this, but could you just speak again quickly to the names of the individuals who are on the first two paintings that you shared?
Yeah, sure. So I think you're asking about the first slide.
Correct.
So the person on the left is unknown. We don't know who that is. Again, it may have depicted a real person, perhaps a white privateer, but it was painted over in the hopes that having an African American privateer, it'd be worth a lot more. And that's at least what I read about the history of that painting. The one on the right is of James Fortin. So he's the wealthy individual from Philadelphia who established a sailmaking business after serving the Revolutionary War when he was a teenager.
Great. Thank you. Next question. If an enslaved sailor served, I imagine that the money in the spoils went to the slave owner or enslaver. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, without question. I think in most of those scenarios, the enslaver would have gotten any of the wealth. And, I honestly don't know all the particular cases, but the best possible scenario for an enslaved person is they might get a very small amount of that. But I'm sure it's dependent on the particular case. In most cases, I would assume that the enslaver would get uh, the value from that labor.
Yeah. For sure. And then I'm not sure if you can answer this one or not. So totally fine if this is a little bit outside of your purview here. But could you comment about black sailors on French and Spanish ships slash navies? How different were they with respect to work and freedom post-war pensions, etc.? And again, I know that that's kind of more global, but if you came across that in any of your readings, feel free to speak to it.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that question. My focus has mostly been on the British and American navies, but nonetheless, I do know that many people would uh, fight for different sides. You would have all sorts of interesting scenarios in which you had Americans fighting on British ships and vice versa. And so a lot of navies were very global. So I certainly wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. But unfortunately, I don't know. I don't have any of that information about French and Spanish navies with people of color serving on those. I'd imagine, like I said, it probably did, but I haven't come across any examples.
Yeah, no problem. Um, So another question, someone did in the Q&A section did drop a really interesting link, which I'm happy to share with you, about an individual named William Reed, with an 1817 incident on Artillery Election Day in Boston Harbor. So I'll definitely pass that along to you. It's a story I'm unfamiliar with. Don't know if you've heard of it before, but it seems pretty interesting. Um, okay, so then another question came in about since Fortin refused to renounce his association with the colonies, he paid a terrible price by being imprisoned on the prison ship. Are you aware of any monuments that commemorate Fortin, whether in Philadelphia or anywhere in the United States?
That is a great question. I don't, and there could very well be. I'm not aware of one. I know in Brooklyn there was a monument. I think it was put up in 1908 for all those who perished on the British prison ships in New York Harbor. But I'm not aware of any monument to Fortin. There very well could be, but fortunately, I don't know.
And then there was a question about Fortin and colonization. I believe you said that Fortin was in favor of colonization. Is that correct?
No, sorry if that was lost in translation. No, Fortin was against it.
Okay. So he was against colonization. Great. I think I just misunderstood what you were saying. So all good. Um, okay. Great. All right, we have a couple other oh, and then finally, and again, if can you comment about Black British sailors with respect to freedom after fighting for the British, like the Dunmore or Clinton proclamations? So I guess the question is kind of looking at like for those individuals who fought on the side of the British, um, how was what was their experience like after the revolution?
Yeah, so again, I can't speak to any specific examples that I found. I was hoping to find some. I do know that many people were given freedom by the British. I believe many of them settled in Nova Scotia. But like I said, I didn't come across any specific examples. I would love to find some though.
Great. All right, and then we did get in the chat that someone did say that there is a historical marker for Fortin in Philadelphia. So that's great. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, cool.
All right, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. So thank you for everyone for who hung out for the Q&A. And with that, and obviously thanks to Steve for the presentation. So with that, I can kick it back over to Karen.
That was amazing. Steve, it was so awesome. Thank you so much. I learned so much. I love these presentations, and thank you so much for everyone coming and hanging out with us tonight. The next one will be in 2 weeks when it is the Emancipation in Massachusetts. Hope to see you there. Thank you so much.